The Trump administration is taking aim at a major Canadian export. The U.S. Commerce Department is hiking anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber to 20.56%.
Recovered late morning. Lumber futures are, of course, higher given the news on the 25% tariff on Canada. There is already a 14.5% duty on Canadian lumber.
Ottawa says it has a plan to fight back against new U.S. duties on Canadian lumber.
This is another unjustified tariff. You can expect us to fight against it, and you can expect us to take specific steps to protect those workers.
American officials have long proclaimed that the United States can rely solely on its own forests for lumber, dismissing the need for Canadian timber. This confident assertion is now facing an unexpected challenge. Over the past year, a simmering trade disagreement over wood has escalated into a major confrontation. It began with a sharp increase in tariffs that sent ripples through the construction sector, prompting a swift and bold reaction from Canada. One nation is imposing steep duties, while the other threatens to restrict a vital construction resource. Experts warn this dispute could drive up the cost of building an average home by $14,000 by 2027, with broader impacts looming. Before we dive in, please hit the like button. It helps us navigate YouTube's algorithm. Picture this. Nearly a third of the lumber used in U.S. homes could vanish from the market overnight. That possibility is now alarmingly real. On the morning of July 12th, Washington introduced a hefty 35% tariff on all Canadian lumber entering the country. Within hours, concerns spread across the border. Canada's major lumber-producing regions hinted at retaliating by limiting wood exports. British Columbia's premier, in an interview with Bloomberg News, suggested that export caps, a strict limit on lumber shipped to the U.S., are under serious consideration to reduce trade tensions. Suddenly, America's critical supply of softwood was at risk. An industry analysis cautioned that this tariff, combined with potential Canadian countermeasures, could raise the cost of a new single-family home by $10,000 within a few years. Home builders report they haven't faced a timber shortage this severe since World War II. But Canada's threat of export quotas is just the opening salvo in a larger strategic battle. Restricting lumber doesn't only halt home construction, it could reshape the entire North American supply chain. What happens when every two buy, four becomes a diplomatic bargaining chip? If those exports are restricted or capped, U.S. builders would lose a volume equivalent to 16 Empire State Buildings worth of lumber each month. The Wall Street Journal projects that even a partial shortage of this scale could add $10,000 to the price of a single-family home. Builders nationwide say they haven't seen a timber crisis this acute since the rationing days of the 1940s. Why can't the U.S. simply produce more lumber to bridge the gap? Domestic sawmills would like to step up, but increasing output isn't straightforward. Several obstacles stand in the way. Regulatory hurdles. Expanding logging areas or mill capacity often faces lengthy environmental and permitting processes, slowing down production increases. Labor shortages. The forestry and milling sectors struggle to find enough skilled workers, making it hard to add shifts or expand operations. Resource limits. Wildfires and sustainable harvesting restrictions have reduced available timber in some U.S. regions, capping how much can be cut without harming future supply. These constraints mean U.S. producers can't quickly fill the void left by reduced Canadian imports, even as prices climb. Experts estimate that scaling up domestic lumber production would take years, not months, too slow to address an immediate crisis. As the U.S. tariff barrier rose and domestic mills struggled to keep up, Canada prepared a bold counterstrike. By mid-July, news broke that Canada was ready to leverage its lumber supply as a weapon. On July 16, 2025, a Reuters report highlighted a major shift in Canada's approach. Officials were openly considering export quotas on lumber bound for the U.S. In essence, Ottawa was prepared to limit how much wood its companies could sell to American buyers. The aim was to protect Canadian jobs and ensure enough lumber for a domestic construction surge, even if it left U.S. builders scrambling. British Columbia's premier, David Eby, signaled readiness to impose formal export limits. a sharp departure from Canada's previous reluctance to take such steps. Once quotas are enacted, every 2x4 from Canada becomes a rationed resource for U.S. builders. Why would Canada resort to such a drastic measure? One factor is the high domestic demand for lumber. In Ontario, sawmills are operating at over 80% capacity to support a growing push for sustainable construction, including energy-efficient homes and tall wooden structures. These projects would take priority if exports are restricted, keeping Canadian lumber at home to support local workers and initiatives. In short, if Ottawa limits exports, U.S. importers could lose a significant portion of their supply overnight. Alternative lumber sources are scarce. The U.S. could turn to Europe. Countries like Germany and Sweden have supplied lumber during past shortages. But in 2023, those nations sent just 3.5 million cubic meters of softwood to the U.S., a fraction of Canada's contribution. European lumber also involves longer shipping times and higher costs, making it an expensive and slow substitute. Other countries lack the capacity or logistics to meet America's massive lumber demand quickly. Without a viable backup plan, a Canadian supply cut would leave the U.S. vulnerable. Meanwhile, commodity markets are flashing warning signs. Lumber futures hit $650 per thousand board feet in March, a level not seen since a prior shortage. Analysts warn that if Canada's quotas significantly reduce supply, prices could climb to $765 or beyond, potentially surpassing the record highs of the early 2020s when pandemic disruptions and a construction boom drove costs skyward. Those high prices in 2021 added tens of thousands to new home costs, and a similar surge would burden every starter home and renovation project in America. Economists are sounding alarms. A Reuters survey noted that U.S. single-family housing starts were already at an 11-month low before the quota threats, largely due to high interest rates. A lumber shortage could further depress construction, undermining the housing market's fragile recovery. This lumber dispute is no longer just another chapter in U.S.-Canada trade tensions. It threatens the affordability of home ownership, potentially cutting off access for many families. Canada's response is hitting the U.S. in unexpected ways, and it's not just about restricting raw logs. Here's the surprising tactic we mentioned earlier. Canada is exploring markets beyond the U.S. for its lumber. Thanks to trade agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, tariffs on Canadian forest products will eventually drop to zero in 11 Pacific Rim countries. Nations like Japan, Australia, and Singapore can buy Canadian lumber at market prices free of tariffs, while U.S. buyers face steep duties imposed by their own government. Additionally, the Canada-EU trade agreement, CETA, allows many Canadian wood products to enter Europe duty-free. Canada is signaling to its lumber industry. If the U.S. market becomes unprofitable due to tariffs, other buyers are waiting. Rather than exporting raw lumber, which faces high U.S. tariffs, Canadian mills are being encouraged to focus on higher-value products like engineered wood panels, prefabricated wall sections, and finished cabinetry. These products often avoid the harshest trade penalties and qualify for duty-free treatment under agreements like CPTPP and CETA. Canada's strategy boils down to three key moves: impose export quotas to limit raw lumber shipments to the U.S., ensuring enough for domestic needs, and pressuring American markets. Redirect lumber and wood products to Asia-Pacific and European markets via trade agreements, where they can be sold tariff-free, and shift toward producing higher-value goods like engineered wood and prefabricated materials, which fetch better prices and often bypass U.S. tariffs. This approach protects Canadian jobs, boosts profits, and leaves U.S. buyers competing for a smaller share of lumber at higher prices. If Canada implements quotas before fall, analysts warn lumber prices could soar beyond recent highs, erasing the brief relief builders felt after earlier price stabilization. Canadian mills, particularly in Ontario and Quebec, would likely operate at full capacity, supplying domestic green building projects and tariff-free overseas markets. The U.S., expecting to spar over raw lumber, now faces Canada potentially selling high-value wood products globally. As one commentator put it, America started a trade war over basic 2x4s, and Canada responded by offering the world pre-built skyscraper components. The conflict's impact extends beyond lumber. Washington's protectionist policies have spread to steel, soybeans, and other sectors, affecting nearly every part of the economy. Tariffs that began with would have grown into some of the broadest trade barriers in decades. Yale University's Budget Lab warns that these measures could slow economic growth and increase unemployment by year's end, putting hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk as factories pay more for materials like steel and scale back production. These tariffs also raise consumer prices by an estimated 2.1%, draining an extra $2,800 annually from the average family's budget, a hidden tax that hits without appearing on any bill. Evidence of this tariff-driven inflation is clear in supermarkets and hardware stores. Grocery prices are rising partly because tariffs have increased costs for farming inputs like fertilizer and tractor parts, which trickle down to the cost of produce and meat. U.S. beef producers, already hit by China's ban on American beef in a separate trade dispute, face higher feed and equipment costs, driving up meat prices. In manufacturing, a 35% tariff on imported steel sheets has made producing a mid-sized pickup truck $1,200 more expensive, forcing automakers to choose between absorbing costs or raising prices. Construction faces similar challenges. Beyond lumber, tariffs have increased costs for steel beams, rebar, and other materials used in buildings and infrastructure. Federally funded projects like highways and bridges now face higher material costs, stretching taxpayer dollars thinner. Ironically, policies meant to protect jobs are making construction and infrastructure more expensive. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, warns that high tariffs inflate production costs, reduce competitiveness, and may drive investment abroad as companies seek cheaper inputs elsewhere. This creates a dual price shock. Rising material costs for lumber, steel, and microchips, combined with higher prices for everyday goods like food due to supply chain disruptions and retaliatory tariffs. Financial markets are reacting. The Dow Jones U.S. Home Construction Index has dropped 8% since the tariff announcements, reflecting fears of higher costs and weaker demand. Corn futures have hit a 14-month high, driven by concerns over trade disruptions and rising farming costs. Despite these warnings, the White House insists tariffs will boost domestic jobs and industries. Economists, however, argue that tariffs often create inefficiencies and export losses, outweighing short-term benefits. If Canada restricts lumber, China blocks U.S. beef, and Europe retaliates against American goods, the U.S. could face shortages across multiple sectors during a critical election year, a scenario that could fuel voter frustration and market volatility. This trade war isn't just a policy dispute. It's reshaping consumer behavior. Cross-border shopping between the U.S. and Canada has plummeted. Customs data show a sharp drop in traffic at key border crossings like Niagara's Rainbow Bridge and the Peace Bridge this spring. Each empty vehicle represents lost revenue for U.S. businesses, fewer Canadian shoppers at gas stations, malls, and restaurants. Erie County, New York reported a 7% drop in sales tax revenue, a $4.9 million shortfall attributed to fewer Canadian visitors. Outlet malls and small businesses near the border are seeing double-digit declines in foot traffic, with some restaurants closing early due to lack of customers. A May 28, 2025, survey by Dunphy found that 71% of Canadians plan to buy fewer U.S. grocery products, driven by anger over tariffs and a desire to support local goods. This voluntary boycott could cut weekend revenue for U.S. border retailers by up to a third, compounding the impact of higher inventory costs from tariffs. The Buffalo Chamber of Commerce calls this a double freeze. Canada restricts lumber exports, and Canadian consumers reduce U.S. spending. Washington can't mandate cross-border shopping, and the empty parking lots are pressuring local officials to push for a resolution. However, rolling back tariffs could signal weakness in an election year, leaving the White House in a bind. This trade war now has two fronts: government policies and consumer choices, both moving away from U.S. businesses. If this continues, It highlights a stark reality. Once trade disputes affect public sentiment and spending, they gain momentum that's hard to reverse. Please hit like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.